Oh, you're talking about a repository. I was talking about a big folder that you have your stuff in.
Oh no, I just made it.
Cool, welcome back. How's everyone doing? Good? Cool, so today we're going to go over, we're going to kind of build off of what we did last week where we did AJAX calls and then kind of just did manual rendering by creating strings of HTML and kind of inserting them into the page. And then today we're going to use a client-side templating library called Handlebars. There's a few different templating libraries out there, but Handlebars is one of a pretty popular one, and it's actually kind of the same templating language that Ember uses. So when we get to Ember, you'll kind of already know like just how the templating system works for the most part. So it's kind of a nice transition. If you want to start by downloading the starter files, it's kind of a zip folder. Just click on this, and it just has jQuery, Handlebars, a library called Moment. But it just, so we don't have to like download it and create a bunch of the same files, so we all start on the same page.
Where should we put it?
You can put it anywhere, just maybe your ITP school folder or something. So okay, so I'm gonna do the same. And then unzip it. And then go ahead and open up whatever editor you're using in that folder. Shoot. So while everyone's doing that, does anyone have questions from last week? Just or general questions I can answer. Nope.
Actually,
Yeah.
So because we're like including third-party modules now, could we use npm and Node for
You
projects,
could,
or-
yeah,
Okay.
if you wanted to. This was so simple that it was 3 script files. I just did it this way, but
Okay.
yeah. So this folder kind of has a few different files. It has a blank HTML file. You can just see I've just included the script tags. So there's jQuery, there's Moment, which is a JavaScript library for working with dates and times. It just makes it so if you want to do like relative times or just convert or subtract, it just makes it really easy instead of just using the native date class in JavaScript. Handlebars, which is the templating library that we're going to look at, and then just an empty main.js file, which you can see here. So if you want to go ahead and open this, I'm just going to double click the file and open this in Chrome. And I'm going to open up Chrome DevTools. So just right click and inspect, and then click on console. And so I'll generally just do this every single time I start doing some JavaScript stuff, just so I can see if I start making typos or whatever for errors. Okay, so these are kind of the two files we're going to be working with. So I'm just going to have these side by side, and then you can kind of look at both. Okay, to review just kind of a little bit from last week, we're going to make an AJAX call to the same GitHub API, and right before that, then we'll kind of stop and then look at handlebars and do the rendering. So last week we learned about doing AJAX, and there was a couple ways we did it. We used either $.ajax, that was kind of one approach, or we used that native fetch function in the browser. I'm going to do so $.ajax, we'll just kind of use jQuery. So we're going to say, let's make a GET request to the URL https://api.github.com/users / we'll do this. So this will kind of give the profile for this username. Okay, so let's refresh the page, and then you should see this AJAX call here. So if you don't, let me know, and it's just a setting we have to toggle on. But if we look at this, this is kind of the profile page for that single user. And zoom in a little bit. So if you click on the preview for this person, you can see here's a bunch of different attributes. And so this is kind of the object that we get back when we make that AJAX call. Okay, so we learned that AJAX calls, they return, or $.ajax, it returns this thing called a promise, which is kind of like that object that you get back that you can attach functions to execute when it finishes, for when the AJAX call finishes or if it errors out. And so that object was called a promise. And on promises, they basically work like this, where we say .then, and you can pass in a function. And the first function is kind of the success case. So we'll say log. In this case, it's kind of the user profile that we get back. And then for the second callback function that we passed it, then it's the error case. So I can say, let's see, console.error, and we'll just log out the error if there happens to be one. Okay, so if we go back and refresh on the page, we can see here's the object, and the same thing that we were seeing in the network panel. So that was pretty much last week. Any questions on that? Okay, so last week, right here in this success callback, we just kind of did manual HTML rendering by constructing HTML strings and then injecting them into the page somewhere. And using the kind of backtick quotes, this was kind of helpful because then you could do things like dollar curly and put little variables in the strings, and it made string interpolation pretty easy, so you didn't have to do a bunch of kind of crazy string concatenation, but this is kind of a newer feature in JavaScript, and so this isn't something that's has been around for too long. So kind of back a few years ago, before all this was there, people used client-side templating libraries to make generating HTML really easy and also secure, to prevent like certain cross-site scripting attacks from happening. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to use handlebars. And so the way handlebars kind of works is we're going to define a template in our HTML, and we're going to basically put all of our HTML in our HTML file, and we're going to put this inside this template. And then from our JavaScript, we're going to say, hey, invoke this template and pass it the data that we get back from the AJAX call, and then we can render it that way. So it's kind of like a new little you could say a programming language, but one of the nice things I like about it is it puts your HTML in your HTML file, and it has things like little if statements and loops and stuff, so you can just kind of pass a bunch of data to a template and it will just render it. And then when you look at your template, it looks very declarative. You don't see kind of a bunch of crazy logic in your JavaScript that's kind of trying to build up HTML. It looks very like HTML. Okay, so let's kind of create one of these templates. So in our file, we can there's a tag called template. And I'm going to give this an ID of profile-template. So this template is going to be used for rendering a single GitHub user profile. And so the template tag is actually invisible on the screen. So if I save this right now and I just kind of put really anything in here and I refresh, you're not going to see it on the screen. It's kind of invisible. So it's basically just a way of defining a template in our markup. So what we can do here is just kind of put any HTML. So in this case, I'm going to say that maybe I'm going to have a div with a class of profile. And if I look at this object that we logged to the console, there's a few different things here. But maybe, let's say I want to render the name. So I want to render the name, maybe the login, and maybe the image, which is an avatar URL right up here. So we can just use double curlies like this, and we can say name. We can kind of wrap this inside maybe like an H1 tag. Maybe we also want to say, okay, we'll say blog, colon, and there's a blog property inside this object. So we'll say blog. Let's also do an image. So we'll say source is equal to avatar URL. And for the alt, we can say we'll just put the name. Or I could say something like, name space image. And then we can give it a width of 200. And maybe let's render one more piece of information. We'll say company. And so all of these properties in double curlies are just things off of this object so that I'm picking out. So if you look at this, it kind of looks just like regular markup, but with little placeholders. So if you've ever done any maybe server-side scripting, like with PHP, kind of looks similar where you have the double curlies for the placeholders for where data will get inserted. Any questions? Okay, so we've made the AJAX call. Now I want to invoke this template and pass it the data. So there's a few different things that we need to do. First, we need to basically the process of this is we just kind of grab this template tag by its ID or some selector. We're just going to kind of grab the inner HTML of this template, and so this just becomes a string, and then we're going to use handlebars to say, hey, pass it the data. So the first part we need to do is just say, we'll call this profile template string. So I'm going to be extra explicit so you can see the steps, but I'll say document dot get element by ID. We'll say profile template. Now you could use jQuery for this too. Dot inner HTML. So all we did was just grab the inner HTML of this template. So it's really just a string. So if I log this out, so if I do console.log profile template string and refresh, you can see here's our template. It's just a string. Okay, so now we're gonna say, we're gonna let Handlebars know about this template string. And the way we do that is we say handlebars.compile. And so we're saying, here's this template, it's just a string, compile it, so it's gonna do some optimization so that when data is passed to it, it will render it a lot more quickly. So what this gives us back is a function. And so I'm going to call this something that sounds like a function, and I'm going to call it render profile. So we give handlebars.compile the template string. It gives us back a function. And this function is what we use to invoke it and pass the data so that it can render it. Any questions? So these are kind of two steps that you just do at the top of the page. You only have to do them once. So even if you render the profile multiple times in your app, you only have to place this part at the top. So you only have to compile the template once, and then you can just reuse this render profile function as many times as you want. Okay, so we're going to make the AJAX call, and then we're going to call render profile. And we're going to pass it directly the user profile. Or you know what, actually here, let me kind of backtrack. I'm going to pass it an object, and I'm just going to put some hard-coded data for now just so you can kind of see it working. So in my template, it says name, blog, and company. So I'll say name, blog, company, so when I call this render profile, I pass it an object, and the keys of that object represent the variable names in the template. So you can see here's a key name, it matches with this name, this blog matches with this blog, same with company. I'm not doing anything for avatar URL, but you would pass that as an in as well. Okay, and so what this gives us back is I'm going to call this rendered profile. So it kind of gives us a string with all of these little placeholders replaced with the actual data that the function was called with. So if I kind of go right after this and do a console log on rendered profile, this is just going to be the same template, but with the data swapped, or with the placeholders swapped with the actual data. So if I go and refresh, you can see here's that rendered profile, and now you can see the little placeholders were swapped. Okay, so now that we have this rendered profile, we can just do whatever we want with the string. We could inject it into another div, or we could just append it to the page. So in this case, I could just say something like document.body, or you know what, we'll just use jQuery. So we'll say, we'll grab the body, and we'll say append the rendered profile. And if I refresh, you can see here's kind of the rendered template. Yeah, question.
So handlebars maps out the like I guess like JSON object to the actual template.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the little object that we pass to that function, it'll kind of map this to the little placeholders.
Okay.
Yeah. So here, oh yeah, another question?
Like my color is same, but it says on console section.
Mm,
And that relates to the handlebars JS file. I don't know what.
I'll leave it up, or maybe, I don't know off the top of my head, but maybe just follow along and then hopefully you catch it, or we can check it out in lab. Okay, so I just did kind of a hard-coded object, but this object right here is essentially a like subset of the same properties as the one we get back from our AJAX call, right? If we look at the one we get back from our AJAX call, it has blog, company, name. So we can actually just take this raw object that we got back from our AJAX call to GitHub and just pass it directly to the template. So if I just delete this, and I just say user profile, which is kind of, the same keys and everything, and then refresh, you can see the rendered AJAX call using handlebars. So I can clean this up a little bit. I'll just delete the console logs. Any questions? So far this doesn't look a whole lot different than just taking our same template that we had before and just doing it in our JavaScript file when we use those backticks. But what Handlebars is really good at is we can just put little amounts of display logic in the template, so we can have little if statements, we can have little function calls, we can have each loops, and it just makes the whole template a lot more expressive and readable, as opposed to kind of like writing the plain JavaScript in there. And it also has like a bunch of security benefits too, which you can read about. But let's go ahead and do another AJAX call, and then we'll kind of see some of that in action. All right, so we're gonna do one to fetch the repos of a user. So we'll say, while we're at it, we can just check out one of these other functions. So $.getJSON is kind of like, or it's basically the shorthand for this. So we'll say get JSON, get this person's repo. So the same URL, but just tack on /repos at the end of the URL. And we'll say .then. And what we get back is an array of repos. And I'll do a console log on the repos. So if I go back and refresh, kind of the same call as last week, but we have this array. And let's go ahead and make another template now. So I'm going to define another template in my HTML tag, or my HTML document. And I'll call this ID equals repos template. Okay, so inside this template, we can actually use, we're going to use a special keyword called each. And so it says double curly pound each. And imagine we have a variable called repos in this template, and this is going to be an array. So we're basically going to take that same array that we got back from the API and pass it to this template. And that's what this repos variable will be. So we're going to say, let's kind of loop over each of these repos. And so this each helper has kind of two parts, the opening and closing tag. So it kind of looks, the closing tag kind of looks like HTML with the slash. The opening one has this extra pound in there. But this essentially allows us to loop over things inside of a template. So we're going to say, let's kind of put this all inside a div. And each div will have a class of repo. And let's start with adding kind of an h3 tag. So we'll say h3, and each repo has a name. So if I kind of go over here and expand this, we can see, let's see, where's name? Here we go. So we're going to say, okay, the thing between the each right here, it's kind of each repo's object in the response, and so we can just pick off the properties of the object. So it kind of really works pretty nicely when you have like an array of objects. You can work with arrays of other things too, but you know that tends to be a common scenario. So this is how it works. Okay, so let's just leave name for now, and let's call it from our JavaScript file. So at the top, we're going to do the same thing. So we'll say repos template string is equal to document dot get element by ID. Say repos template dot inner HTML. So just again grab that template as a string. And then we're going to compile the template so that we get that function. In this case, we'll call the function render repos. So we'll do the same thing and call handlebars dot compile and pass it the repos template string. And then when our AJAX call finishes or completes successfully, we're going to say render repos. And just like with the render profile, we're going to pass in an object. And in this case, we're going to say repos because in our template, we created this variable called repos. So we're going to have a key here called repos. So just make sure these two match. And this is going to be repos. So I'll actually just rename this so maybe it's a little less confusing. So what we get back from, oh, well, I got to change this too. Okay, so what we get back from the API, I just called that variable repositories. And then when I call render repos, I take that repositories variable, assign it to a key called repos, and then that gets what's, so that's what the array is inside that each. Any questions? Yeah. 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 So what we get back from the API, this is just a repository, so like the entire array, which we kind of see in the console. So you can see it's we have this array of objects. We assign it to an object key called repos. So this keyword repos matches to this each repos. And then so that's how it knows what to loop over. Okay, so what we get back from this is just like before, a string, but with all the data swapped out. So we'll call this rendered repos. So this is just kind of another HTML string, but with the little data placeholders swapped out with the actual data. And in this case, so you wouldn't see like an each anymore. The each would get replaced with 20 divs with a class of repo with the name inside. And then we can just kind of take this and append it to the page. So I'll say grab the body. We're going to say append the rendered repos. Yes?
So because the template doesn't show up anywhere, that's just kind of formatting. So like what actually shows up is this thing that you append.
Exactly, yeah.
And just shows up in the format given by template.
Yep,
It
yep.
doesn't
So
matter where the template goes.
exactly, yeah. Because actually, if we so okay, if we look at this, we can see it's actually rendered. And if I click on the elements panel and go inside body, and we look at this, oh, whoops. We can see here's the two template tags, but because I appended it, both the profile and all the repos, we can still just see it in the DOM.
Okay.
Yeah, if we look at these, we can see, okay, H3, just they're each repo name. And so, yeah, you can see kind of all of these repos displayed. So before like all the JavaScript framework came out, this was pretty popular, and so people kind of made their own little like JavaScript frameworks just around this idea of client-side templating, jQuery, and some plain Java, just JavaScript to make rendering things a little bit easier, and to kind of put HTML inside HTML because generally people found that more maintainable. Frameworks have kind of changed that idea a little bit, so it's a little, but still good to kind of just know that this exists because a lot of frameworks are just like, this was the base of before all that started. And Ember actually today still uses this Handlebars templating language, but you just don't have to do like all of this stuff at the top, which we'll see later on.
So do the templates have to be in our like entry point index, or can there be like a separation?
They just have to be somewhere in the DOM.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of doing it. So like, so I guess this is just one approach, but there are other there are other approaches where people have like put this in separate files and everything, but then you need like a build tool to kind of like eventually stitch it all together into the DOM so that by the time it runs, this element is on the page so you can find it.
Okay.
Okay, so let's render a little bit more information than just the name. So I'm going to say put a paragraph tag, and I'm going to say created at. We'll say created at underscore at. So this is just another property in here. So you can see created underscore at. It's kind of a date time. So we'll display that. We'll also do last updated. And this is located at updated at. Also display the description. And I'm going to close the or let's see, I'll put it on the right hand side. Okay, so we can see each repo. You can see created at, last updated. Some of them have descriptions. So in this case, this one had a description, but this one didn't. So Handlebars, like I mentioned before, it has some nice little helpers for like small amounts of conditional logic in our template. So the way this works is we can say, kind of like with each, there's one called if, and we can say if description. And so if is kind of similar to the if statement in JavaScript, where if there's something, it's true. If there's either empty string, false, null, that counts as falsy. So we'll say if description, we'll do that, else, and then we'll say close if. So here we can say no description. So if we go and refresh, we can see no description for the first one, and then here's this description for the second.
So
Yeah.
this is all handlebar?
Yep, this is all handlebars.
Okay.
Yeah, basically the part where you compile the template and then render it and then just define the template. It's all handlebars.
Okay.
So you can think of it kind of like a template programming language.
Okay.
So if we expand kind of the object a little bit, there's also another property called, I think, stargazers count. Maybe I think it might be people who like watched that repo. But some have 0, some have numbers. So we can do something similar, and we can say pound if stargazers count. So if it's 0, it'll be considered false. Anything else will be considered true. So we'll close the if statement and then put in an else. So if there's a stargazers count, we'll say something like stars colon stargazers count. And otherwise, we'll say no stars. You might have like star icons or something, but so if we go back and refresh, you can see, okay, this one had 8 stars, 2 stars. This one has no stars. And you kind of see it working. Yep.
This is also like, wanted to do like multiple like print statements, would you have to like enclose in brackets or
What do you mean by?
like, or like if you were to like after stars do like, I don't know, like name of the star or whatever?
Oh,
Would you have to enclose that in a bracket or in braces or?
like, oh, inside here. Oh, you mean like multiple if parts in the if statement?
Yeah.
Oh, that's where there's a couple different ways. You might have to pre-format the data in just plain JavaScript before sending it to the template. So you might have to do like a map for each, whatever,
Okay.
before sending it. Or there's something called helpers, which you can kind of like invoke little functions, which we'll actually get to. But yeah, there's a few ways to kind of do it.
Okay.
Yeah, the main idea is like they wanted to make it somewhat restrictive so that when you look at the template, it looks simple and it doesn't look too complicated with like full-on JavaScript in there.
Right.
So they kind of it you know, it lets you do a little bit, but forces you to do maybe more complicated stuff outside.
Okay.
Any questions? Yeah, love questions.
And then so for this if stargazers, is that just saying like if it's not null?
If it's truthy, so truthy would be basically any like 1 and up, right?
Okay.
But falsy would be 0 or basically 0,
Okay.
0, null, or false. But I
and
think looking in the response, it's basically a number, so it's 0 or a number.
then- okay.
So we look at kind of what we rendered for each repo, like this created at and last updated at dates. They're basically timestamps. Not super pretty. It would be nice if we did something a little bit more user-friendly. Using the plain date object in JavaScript, it's a little hard to work with. So there's a really good library called Moment.js. And so that's the one I already included in the starter files. But this is kind of like the de facto, like if you're trying to do things with dates and times, most people go to this. It's a really great library. And you can do things like give it a date and format it into any of these different, formats. So there's kind of like these symbols. You can, like 4 M's represent like the full month, but 2 M's represent either the number of the month, I forget exactly which, but it's all kind of documented here. And so you can also do like relative time and say like 7 years ago, kind of like what you see like on Facebook or I think Instagram a few seconds ago. So stuff like that, which would be kind of hard to do ourselves, you can just do it easily with this library. So let's see, where is it? So I'm just going to copy this date out, and then we can kind of go inside Moment.js. They actually have it loaded on their page, so you can just kind of copy it out and just mess around with it. So if I type in moment here, you can see the functions loaded on the page. And so what I can do is I can say I'll pass in moment, that same date that I just copied, and you could call things like format. So if I did something like format for, I think there was like 4 M's, you can see it's November. So I'll copy one from the example. So I paste it 4 M's, DOYYY. Like this stuff, you just have to look in the docs. No one really remembers it, but you can say, okay, November 28th, 2010. So really powerful. It just makes the date display and formatting super easy. So if you go to, I think, let me expand this a little more, docs. And if you go to display, those tokens, like the M's, the D's, you can see what they produced here. So you can just kind of look at them and just put any combination you want and just construct your own date based on one of these formats. But one of the ones that I really like is just the relative one. So if you've seen like on Twitter, it says like posted 5 seconds ago, and it just makes it all relative. So you can say like from now, that was 8 years ago. So stuff like that where it just really handy, and like doing this by yourself would actually be pretty hard. And this comes to, I think, if you go inside Moment and go under Query, you can take 2 dates. You can say like, you know, is one before or after? How much time is between them? And I think the one that I just called is, let's see, relative. Oh, time from now. Here we go. So kind of these relative formats. So really cool stuff.
How did you get to this again?
Oh, Moment.js? Oh, let me pick.
Slash docs. No, I got there, but how did I?
Oh yeah, I think I just clicked on the docs link. If you you might have to expand your browser because the navigation changes a little bit.
Oh.
But yeah, click on docs and then. So what I want to do in this little app is I want to convert both this created at and last updated at to use the relative timestamps. So if we look at our template, I basically want to call a function on each of these values, right? And so in Handlebars, the way we can do that is we can register what's called a helper. And so you can think of a helper as just a function. So in this case, I'm going to define a function. So I'll just kind of define it maybe at the top somewhere. And I'm going to say handlebars dot register helper, and I'm going to give the first argument to this is a name. So in this case, I want to give it a name of format date, or you know what? Let's maybe call it a relative date. And then the second argument to this register helper function is the function itself. So in our case, we're going to call this relative date function on these two values, and it's going to take that date, and then we just want to return another date, so the relative form. So we're going to say the first parameter to this function is the date. Oops. And we're going to say return moment. We're going to kind of wrap that in the date, and we'll say from now, just kind of like what we did on the moment console. So going back to here, when I said this, same thing, but I'm just returning that from this little helper function. And so to call this, we can go back to our template, and we just say format dash date space and then the parameter. So in this case, we'll just say format dash date. Oh wait, no, we didn't call it format date. We called it relative date. So relative date space and then the arguments. In this case, we're only passing one thing to our helper, but you could pass multiple things. So in this case, if we had other things, we could say A, B, C. Just pass them just space delimited. Yep.
So there were two arguments inside one double brackets, which means like the first is like the function and the other is the argument.
To over here?
No, in the template.
Oh, in the template, yeah. So anything after relative date is the arguments that get passed to this function.
So if there's only one thing in the double bracket, so that's just like one argument.
Yeah, right now there's just one argument. Yeah. So if we go back and refresh, let's see. Relative date. Oh, I forgot to save it. Dang it, yeah. There we go. Okay, so you can see 8 years ago, a month ago. Yeah.
Do you know if handlebars will call that function that you made if it receives like an invalid argument or a null object?
Yeah, it'll still call it. So you might have to do some like extra logic. So, only if there's a created at, wrap it around like an if or something. Or you could also, I guess, do that logic in the helper itself. Just say if there's a date, do it. Yeah. Any questions? So that's pretty much it for the client-side templating today. The only other thing I wanted to kind of cover today was just introducing you to some how to define functions using kind of new JavaScript features. Because when we get into Ember and some, we just look at especially things online, we're gonna see there's some of the newer syntax in JavaScript, and so I just want to expose it to you little by little, just so you can kind of get familiar with it. So, because if you look at it all at once for the first time, it looks like a whole new language. So just want to introduce like little bits of it. So we kind of saw like the template strings where you do the backticks and you put little variables inside, and the let defining variables with let instead of var. Another one for functions is, we can define functions with this function keyword, and then you have the parentheses and then the two brackets. We can actually get rid of the function keyword, and then between the parentheses and the curly brackets, you can put what they call a fat arrow. So makes it a little shorter.
Isn't there something with that and like it solves some scoping issues or something?
Yeah, I wasn't even gonna bring that up, but yes, it does. It solves this issue.
Yeah. But in the huge majority of throwaway functions, we're not really worried about scoping as much. It's very nice.
Yeah, I'd say most people end up just using it because it's shorter.
Yeah.
But it does solve the weird this issue if you run into it. Yeah, so if we go back, we can kind of change some of these to fat arrow functions. change this one too. We might be able to do this one. So
That one works.
it does? Okay, I wasn't sure. Yeah, okay. Cool. So you don't have to use it, but it's just more of like, yeah, there's all these little new things in JavaScript that you're going to see. So might as well introduce it to you little by little. And then let's see. Okay, so let's look at kind of assignment. So if you click on assignment 2, what I want you to do is copy your files from assignment 1. So don't copy the entire folder, just copy the actual files that you did from assignment 1. And the reason for that is you're basically you're taking assignment 1 and adding client-side templating to it, but I want it to be its own separate repo, and if you copy the folder, assignment 1, it has, remember that .git folder in there? So if you copy the folder, then you're also going to copy the repo. So what you actually need to do is just open up assignment 1, copy the individual files, and then just paste them into a new directory so that they become just not tied to assignment 1's repo. So that's really just what this says. So I just want you to have a separate repo for it. We can do it in lab today if you want to just make sure you get that squared away. And you're going to take kind of the same thing, but just do the rendering through Handlebars. And so I added a few things in here. So like I want you to add title and the URL. Let's see, a title that links to the URL. I think in assignment 1 it was just show the title, but now you're going to wrap it inside like an anchor tag. You're going to do show the score. The subreddit subscribers is it's a number that shows how many subscribers for that subreddit. So I want you to format that with commas. So I think it's just like a raw integer, and I just want you to put like, you know, every 3 digits, put a comma in there. And so you don't have to do that by yourself because that could be a little tricky. So there's actually just something built into the number class in JavaScript called toLocaleString. And if you just call it on there, it'll just do it for you. You can actually do it for different locales. So for the US, it'll be the 3, every 3 digits, it'll put in a comma. And then for the number of comments, you can show no comments or the number. And let's see. You're also going to do a little bit of error handling. So I think when you do a search, you could type in like, you know, a bunch of gibberish, and there might not be a subreddit that exists for it. So in that case, make sure you just handle that error. And in the event that, you know, no results come back, then I think display, oops, something went wrong. Otherwise, you'll see the results. Any questions? So next week we'll look at JavaScript classes and the Google Maps API. So like how do we plot things on a map? And that's very heavy on like JavaScript classes. So I think it's a good practical use for showing a library that uses classes, because pretty much all of Ember and a lot of other frameworks are very class-based, and just understanding what a class is, because it's kind of might be a new thing for some of you. So we'll look at just like the syntax, how it works, and then see it in action in an actual library, which is Google Maps. And I think that's it for today. Any questions?